My name is Jules and I am both pleased and proud to be your MC for today's event. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. International Day Against Homophobia, or IDAHO as it became known, was first held in 2004 to draw attention to violence and discrimination experienced by LGBTQI people internationally. In 2009, following recognition that trans communities experienced gender-based violence and discrimination with distinct patterns which differ from homophobia, the name of the day evolved to International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, or IDAHOT. This year, many organisations, including Latrobe University, have adopted the acronym IDAHOBIT to encompass people who identify as bisexual or intersex. IDAHOBIT is held annually on May the 17th, with the date chosen to commemorate the World Health Organisation's decision in 1990 to declassify homosexuality as a mental disorder. Today, I am joined by 5 panel members with a diverse range of expertise and experience to discuss a number of themes that relate to queerphobia both here at the university and within the broader community. So let's meet our panellists. First of all, Ada, welcome.
Thank you.
Ada is a student here at Latrobe University, completing her honours in Gender, Sexuality and Diversity Studies, which includes researching queer, trans and intersex content in sex education in Victorian high schools. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
And how's the study going?
Oh, it's going about 10 to 12 hours a day. It's full speed ahead, so I'm really glad to get a break even for now.
Oh, fantastic. Next we have Carl Brown. Carl, you work here at Latrobe University. The Alumni Relations Coordinator. Can you tell us a little bit about that role?
Yeah, basically my role is to help to engage the university's graduates in kind of mutually beneficial partnerships, whether it be through getting graduates back to speak in lectures or to engage them in other sorts of activities. And also I work with a fundraising team who help to build the university's philanthropic aspects.
Fantastic. And you're also a member of the Ally Network, which is committed to creating an inclusive and respectful culture at Latrobe University for queer community members. So welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
Brenda, welcome Brenda. Brenda Appleton, you have been actively involved in the transgender community for over 15 years and you are currently the Treasurer of Transgender Victoria.
Yes.
You're also on the LGBTI Ministerial Advisory Committee at the state level. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of that particular group?
This group, which was appointed by the state government at the start of last year, reports to the Ministers of Health and Mental Health and is reporting on LGBT health and wellbeing. And I actually chair the Transgender and Intersex Working Group, and we are in the process of preparing recommendations at the moment, which we hope will be lodged with the government well ahead of the next election and form part of the, forming the part of the activities that we hope the government will engage on over the next 3 years.
Wonderful, thank you. Beck Thompson?
Yes.
Beck, you are one of 2 national queer officers for the National Union of Students, which is the peak representative body for undergraduate students working to protect the rights of students across Australia. You're part of the queer department in NUS. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the campaigns on issues that affect students in the LGBTQI community that the queer department is focusing on?
Yeah, for sure. So our biggest campaign at the moment is looking at lobbying universities around having accessible bathroom facilities for all students, especially students that are transgender or gender non-conforming. And that one is called We All Need to Pee. We started it last year. And have been going about subversively stickering campuses across the country to raise awareness about the issues faced by transgender students. And we're in the process of building on that with a bit of research and broadening the resources available. We're also running a campaign at the moment for IDAHOBIT Week and helping campuses across the country run their own events this week and over the weekend.
Great. Thank you. And lastly but not leastly, Georgia Dukakis. Georgia, you are the Voice Clinic Coordinator at the Latrobe Communication Clinic in the Faculty of Health Sciences, where apparently over 85% of people who attend the Voice Clinic attend for voice feminisation as part of their social transition to their true female gender. Georgia, how long have you been working in this field?
Well, I've been working in this field since 1980. We started at Lincoln Institute before the Department of Human Communication Sciences amalgamated with Latrobe University. So we've been at Latrobe University since 1990.
And no doubt you've seen a lot of change in that time.
I've seen an awful lot of change in that time. We'd like to see more, though.
We'd like to see more. And there's always, no matter how much we achieve, there's always more to achieve. So let's get stuck into today's discussion. Beck, I might throw the first question to you. You're one of the national queer officers at the NUS. What is the relevance of IDAHOBIT to educational institutions such as Latrobe University?
Yeah, sure. I think what we've seen and across the whole of Australia with the amount of campuses that have picked up the IDAHOBIT campaign and are running events this week, that there's a real broadening of this awareness in queer departments, that the issues are broader than just homophobia themselves, and I think that's reflected by, the IDAHO Day change to IDAHOT and now IDAHOBIT. And a lot of queer departments wanting to improve their reach, broaden the diversity of the students that they interact with and they represent, and that they help.
Just picking up on that point around the change of names, as we've heard, IDAHOBIT first started off as IDAHO, then IDAHOT. Brenda, why do you think it's important to expand scope to specify sexual and gender identity when naming discrimination?
I think that discrimination and rejection and social exclusion occur in different formats in different communities. And for all of us that are part of one of those community, it is important that we can identify with the day, with the week, with the activities that are taking place. And I guess the difficulty we end up with is that we end up with a little bit of an alphabet soup. And I guess I'm concerned that it gets some discreditation in the general community because there are so many acronyms and so many additions to the acronym, but it's also important to include all aspects of the community. And I guess LGBTI isn't one community, it is a range of communities, and we need to recognise that there are different aspects of the difficulties faced by different members of the different communities.
Georgia, would that be, in terms of your research and your experience over the years, naming, for example, transphobia? How important is that to differentiate and have that point of differentiation rather than just using an umbrella term like homophobia or?
I think it's important because there seem to be, I think, more specific discrimination. Really, it's I think it's more extreme, the discrimination against the transgender population, transsexual individuals. I think it's very important.
So I'll just throw to the panel generally now. What we talk about bullying and discrimination. What sort of form can, for want of a better word, queer-phobic bullying take? Carl, what's your take on that?
Well, it's an incredibly broad range of bullying aspects that can be seen. That you've got right from one extreme of physical violence all the way through to discrimination, all sorts of very subtle but really very serious to the individual forms of bullying. It can be as simple as calling someone a name, for example. It could be that you're excluding someone from a group activity purely because of a kind of a dislike or a misunderstanding of their particular situation. So there's a whole range. It's very, very broad in the same way as the communities are very, very broad.
Ada, in your research, have you come across queerphobic bullying in school environments?
Yes, my research is really relating to sex education or sexuality education in high schools, and that question is really apt for my research so far. A lot of the discourse around the topic of sexuality education actually relates to bullying, and a lot of schools seem to have their focus on supporting queer, trans, intersex students through anti-bullying measures. However, something that I've really noticed in my thesis is that it doesn't, therefore, like, sometimes youth can be like desexualized through a focus on bullying. If you focus so much on bullying, then you leave out other parts of like a student's whole, for example, their sexuality or their gender identity and the ways that they interplay with each other, if you just focus too much on bullying. So I think a broad range view, a scope that involves all of these parts of a child or a person, is really important in these discussions.
And what sort of impact we hear about, can have a negative impact on individuals? What sort of impact are we talking about? Let's say, Brenda, from a health perspective, mental health perspective, what sort of impact can queerphobic bullying have on individuals?
I met with the authors and researchers of Growing Up Queer just last week, and this was a study done in Sydney. And they had more than 50 transgender people who responded to the survey, and 78% of those students had either attempted suicide or self-harmed. And therefore the impact of bullying, the impact of discrimination and social exclusion is frequently going to be evidenced with self-harm. A huge percentage with suicidal ideation, and a significant number, more than 25, had in fact attempted suicide. There was a study done in the United States 3 years ago, nearly 6,500 people of the trans community, and more than 41% had attempted suicide. So the manifestation of discrimination and the other forms that it can take is horrendous.
The stats speak for themselves. Obviously, there's such a negative impact, and that's obviously the stats that have been recorded. So I guess there's a lot of unreported or unrecorded stats that sit behind those figures as well. So, which to me makes it even more concerning. Georgia, you've heard firsthand the experiences of many individuals who have attended the Latrobe Communication Clinic. How can experiences of transphobia impact upon an individual's progress in their therapy from what you've experienced?
It can have a significant impact. Firstly, the process of therapy requires that someone attends on a regular basis if they're going to make any progress. And because of the emotional journey that often accompanies transition, which is aggravated through transphobia, the progress is often impacted by non-attendance, having to cancel because of something having occurred to the person the day before they've come into the clinic, whether they've experienced the transphobia on the streets or whether it's been from family members. It's not uncommon for people to experience transphobia from their family members, and that can have a really significant impact. So someone who might be very happy and progressing very well in therapy one week will come the next week having been looking forward to a birthday celebration during the course of the week, and the children have come to visit, and one child has walked into the flat backwards, and so the person is extremely distressed when they come for therapy. So it impacts significantly in terms of how they can concentrate when they come to therapy and how much time we spend dealing with the result of the transphobia, and it can have a very significant impact.
And I suppose if you, Beck, if you were to speak from the student's perspective, the impact on students studying, attending university, trying to participate in the life of the university, what sort of impact could you expect to see on students who experience queer-phobic bullying within a university environment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely impacting on, I guess, all aspects of a person's life, and study included, when those people are students. We often hear about like trans youth homelessness issues, especially when people are thrown out of home because of like family misunderstandings. We've in our like the National Union Students Forum at the end of last year, going over a queer policy discussion, the amount of kind of impassioned students that were speaking about their own personal experience with homelessness because they identified as trans or queer and did not have the support of their families, and then them still trying to struggle through and continue studying. The queer rooms on some campuses that will have people sleeping in them overnight because they have nowhere to go. Yeah, look, the issues are like quite prevalent and quite serious, yeah.
Now let's have a look at language and how powerful language can be. Queer-phobic language appears to remain as one of the few socially acceptable forms of discrimination in our society at the moment. For example, the use of the phrase, "that's so gay," to describe something as inferior or not cool. Carl, is queer-phobic language too often downplayed and dismissed as banter within social media, for example?
I think we are at a weird point in time where there is a certain level of acceptance, obviously, of a queer culture and queer communities, but that has now got to the point where those that still engage in the use of queer-phobic commentary or whatever are almost more comfortable doing it now than back when the advocacy wasn't quite so high, because people almost don't see it anymore. It's not necessarily seen as something that is fought for as much as it has been in the past, and I think that maybe enables some of it to go unnoticed because you kind of go, oh, he doesn't really mean it, or something like that, and I think that's a really dangerous situation to be in.
So I guess it's almost a rise in and what we could term as casual homophobia or casual queerphobia. As you said, sort of slurs that aren't always meant to be harmful, but are used without thinking of the consequences, and actually can have quite devastating consequences. Ada, children will often imitate and repeat words and phrases as they grow up. When a child uses the word gay to describe a piece of clothing or a classmate's actions, is it acceptable to simply argue that they don't know what they're saying or they don't really mean it?
Well, I would argue that that's a key point of education. Like, regarding anything in schools, like, aren't we educating to create better children who will do well in society and respect other people? I know, for example, when I was in high school, when I came out in about 2005, literally the only content interaction I had with anything that was queer was my peers saying, "That's so gay." Like, that was literally the only way that anyone ever spoke about anything queer, and I found that just so harmful. Just trying to come out when there was everything around me that was just so negative, and then just trying to be the only queer person that I knew and just be my own role model, excuse me. And I think we can start with language, and that's just a really telling and strong way, and perhaps easier than other ways of just trying to create a more positive and supportive community for young people.
Brenda, has the issue of language come up in your work on the Ministerial Advisory Council and the harmful effects of casual homophobia or queerphobia, for want of a better word? Has that been discussed at that ministerial level?
We have had discussions on that, and some of it relates to appropriate use of pronouns. So when somebody transitioned, and interestingly enough, we get about the same number that transition from male to female as female to male, so it's not just a one-way thing. It is important for people to accept their change of name and to honour and respect their choice of pronoun. And all too often, we find that people are discriminated against and so on through the inappropriate use of pronoun, and that can be very very damaging and isolating for the person that's involved. One of the challenges, I think, for people today is a lot of young people no longer identify necessarily as transgender, and there is a growing proportion who identify as gender diverse, and therefore they're trying to move away from the binary of male to female, masculine and feminine. We like to describe in many cases that it becomes a kaleidoscope as to how we describe ourselves, and it's a multifaceted thing, and it's not on a straight line, it's not on a continuum, it is a kaleidoscope. And a lot of these people are comfortable, they might be gender fluid, and they might move backwards and forwards between male and female. They might identify as a third gender, or just somewhere in between. And therefore for them, it becomes a little bit of a challenge for people to relate to them in terms of getting the pronoun right. I have many friends who choose not to have a pronoun related to them. Some like to use they. There is an increasing number that like to use Z or something else. And therefore it's important for people, if they want to be respectful of that individual, it's important for people to respect their identity and their choice of pronoun.
And sorry if I can just add, and often that's a case that you have to ask the individual because it is such an individual thing. And I think it does actually cause a little bit of difficulty for people generally when there are so many terms that are used. Yeah. And I think it causes a lot of confusion. We tend to, well, I'm saying we tend to, but this may not even be the case, consider transgender as that umbrella term that incorporates people who do actually want to live or choose according to the binary of male or female, as well as those people who are gender fluid and anywhere along the course. But I do think the terminology does cause confusion for people.
Where do we start if we look at say the broader community and we want to really engender some change within acceptance and greater understanding of that gender diversity that we talk about? Where do we start with raising awareness and educating people around, as we talked about the alphabet soup? How do we help people navigate that particular space, particularly if they're sort of having to deal with their own issues around sort of homophobia, transphobia?
Now, I think that with the passage of time, I think older people today, on the whole, identify as being a trans person and being driven by the binary and therefore choosing to identify as male or female from a gender point of view. Younger people are much more diverse in their expression of gender. So I think with the passage of time, we're going to see a movement away from transgender as being the umbrella term. Within the Ministerial Advisory Committee, we've adopted the term trans and gender diverse. And therefore that is designed to cover the wide range of people who experience gender. I think what is absolutely fantastic is that people feel freer today to explore gender and therefore to be able to be themselves much more easily than when I was young. And I think that that's been a great development. And we talked earlier about the difficulties faced by LGBTI. The trans community feels that it is probably about 12 to 15 years behind the gay and lesbian community in terms of social acceptance and acceptance in the wider community. And I don't think any of us would identify that the gay and lesbians are treated equally, and we feel that the trans community has still got some way to go to catch up to the gay and lesbian community.
Let's move on to a topic that we've briefly discussed, and that's the roles of schools and childhood education in addressing queerphobia, but particularly with a focus on sex education. Now, over the past couple of years, we have seen some progress made in schools in Victoria and I understand across Australia now through the initiatives such as the Safe Schools Coalition. But discrimination is not only perpetuated by what is present, but also by what is absent. Ada, you are undertaking research relating to queer, trans and intersex content in sex education in Victorian high schools. Where are we at with the inclusion of queer topics in sexuality education?
Sure. Well, according to my research, there's currently a huge divide between what Victorian government policy sees as happening and what they advise for and what is actually being experienced on the ground by young people. And that's kind of the real focus of my research, is really emphasising the voices of young people and their experience. I would say that something that's really important is the power of naming and the absolute power in language in itself, because, for example, in a lot of government policy over the last 10 years, there has been discussion of same-sex attracted youth, but there's hardly any discussion at all around trans-spectrum or intersex youth. In fact, there's kind of a conflation that's really happened, even though these groups have different needs, and some of, like, for example, you might hear much more about same-sex attracted youth's needs in the media. I don't think that these policies should be operating within like a paradigm that erases the needs and experiences and very lived experiences of trans and intersex people. And that's something that I've really found come out within what young people have been talking about within my survey of about 100 young people, is that most people learn about queer content in schools or sexuality in sex education. However, maybe 2 out of 104 people ever heard anything about trans.
So how would the inclusion of queer topics in sexuality education help eradicate queerphobia within the school environment and, I guess, more broadly through the community? Beck, what's your view on that?
I mean, I guess it would be about addressing like the kind of misinformation and misconceptions more broadly towards queer and gender diverse people. Like, there's a lot of really good research going on in high schools and with like the Safer Schools program and what you're doing, but what we found is that there isn't like the same kind of research happening in a university space. So we don't know a lot about the experiences of queer students at university and the impacts of programs that are in place through, for example, their student unions, through what we do, through health and counselling. And what else needs to be done. So I think there's kind of a big gap in the research there as well.
I was interested to read that in 2009, the UK government announced that sex education will become compulsory in all schools and include lessons on same-sex relationships and sexually transmitted infections such as HIV, and the teaching is going to begin from the age of 5. Now, there has been some criticism around that particular curriculum, but most people agree that it is a step in the right direction. Carl, you went to school in the UK.
I did.
Given your experience, does it surprise you to learn about that decision, that the UK government has taken these steps to, I guess, make sexuality education compulsory, and secondly, to include queer topics in relation to sexual education?
I don't think it surprises me. There have been significant moves forward in the UK, in the culture generally, around acceptance of things that are outside of the kind of the heterosexual norm. Certainly through the media and so forth, over the course of my growing up, there's been a continuing kind of growth of visibility of homosexuality, trans people, the whole kind of range. And I think that visibility is really important. So I think it's more a reflection of the general UK community point of view at the moment, is that, you know, this is something that we're at the stage where we will accept. And I mean, obviously there are always going to be people who think this isn't something that I want my children to hear about, but as I say, that visibility is crucial in bringing up children and young adults who are tolerant and are open to a diverse range of cultures, communities and backgrounds. So I think it's really good.
And we've heard about the negative impacts upon the mental health of young people, increased suicide rates. Hopefully that we will see some positive outcomes for a decision to for young people who identify as gay, lesbian or transsexual, bisexual, if we do start to embed that understanding at a primary school level. Are we getting close to doing it, Ada?
Well, I really think where there's life, there's hope, and like policy really is reflecting these changes in Victoria. But at the same time, there is the fact that LGBTIQ people experience higher levels of STI transmission, higher rates of pregnancy, and those things, I would argue, are intricately related to a lack of sexuality education that includes queer, trans, and intersex content. It relates to the fact that a lot of these young people can't talk to their parents and ask about sexuality or safer sex practices, and it relates to an erasure in general in society reflecting a lot of these sexualities.
So let's move from the classrooms into the locker rooms and talk about queerphobia in sport. I think it would be safe to say that never before has the issue of queerphobia in sport been so prominent in the media. Just this week, Michael Sam was chosen to play for the St. Louis Rams. I know nothing about American football, but I understand it makes him the first openly gay player to be selected in an NFL draft. And closer to home, in April this year, 5 major professional sporting codes in Australia, AFL, cricket, soccer, rugby league and rugby union, committed to developing anti-homophobia and inclusion policies by August 2014. Beck, are we finally seeing a turning point where members of the queer community will feel safe and included on the sporting field and be okay to be out in themselves, not only in the sporting field but also in sporting administration as spectators?
I think the answer to that will come when we have more out players. Yeah. I don't think it's a case of too little too late, but it's definitely been a long time coming, and especially here. And I guess this is kind of building on the progress that's already been made in those sports, in the areas of partner violence, those kind of things. And I think there's a real kind of a feeling of a need for change. So hopefully some good things will come out of it.
Brenda, do you feel that there's a sense of optimism or hope with these recent events?
Limited. I'm, on behalf of the trans and intersex communities, extremely disappointed that the developments that took place around homophobia in sport excluded the trans and intersex communities. And we were alerted to the discussions that were taking place after the draft announcements had already been made and after the various sporting codes had got together. And again, it's one of those things, too little, too late. So from our point of view, we were very disappointed. And we usually find with these sorts of things, if we miss out at the start, it then takes years to catch up. And we're not optimistic that the code that they've developed will be expanded immediately. Can I just talk about children's education? Yeah. As a point I would like to make. I think one of the most important things we need to do is get our children through school safely. And we find in the trans community, a large number of young people don't get through school successfully. They do get bullied, they don't succeed in their studies, they don't go on to uni, and they struggle for many years to come. We think the Safe Schools Coalition is doing a fantastic job, but its funding is covering about 120, they've done 120 schools in the last 3.5 years. We've got more than 1,700 schools that they should be active in. There isn't enough support from government for this to be expanded. The trans community is involved with Safe Schools Coalition. We're releasing a uniform policy on Friday as part of IDAHOBIT activities. And we've got, for a trans person, having to fit in and wear a school uniform that will not sit comfortably with them is a horrendous thing. And unfortunately in Victoria at the moment we've got a swing towards increasingly having uniforms in place, and therefore this is marginalising an increasing number of students. It is better than Queensland. I met up recently with a family who'd moved from Queensland to Melbourne to get away from the school uniforms up there, and they did find a school where their child was able to transition and go to school here. But it's another area of negativity for young students.
Do you mind if I just add one
Yes,
other point?
absolutely.
I think that the education is important, plays a significant role in supporting transgender individuals, but I think it also plays a role, even though it's not directed to there, at supporting the children of transgender individuals.
That's a good point. Yep.
Okay, because there are a lot of transgender individuals have children who go to school, and it can be very difficult for them having to conceal things about their family. It can be very difficult for the parents who might have to, live a double life while they're still trying to get their kids through school. So it has that point of value as well, I think.
So Brenda mentioned the release of a uniform policy as part of IDAHOBIT for, particularly for people who are students who identify as transgender. Beck, how important are queer-friendly policies, specifically those that address queerphobia in workplaces, university environments?
Yeah, look, incredibly important. And that's like the campaign that I mentioned earlier, We All Need to Pee, with making bathrooms on university campuses more accessible, is a part of that. The campaign itself looks at making people aware of like the harassment that can occur in these spaces, and asks people to, I guess, rethink and reconsider what they've learnt, and to seek more information and to become more tolerant towards gender non-conforming people. We're building on that campaign at the moment to make resources available that campuses can, kind of personalise to their own circumstances, to advertise like support services that are available, university kind of discrimination policies, or where complaints can be made, to try to bring a bit more kind of awareness to the issue. We've got a number of campuses that we're working with that are lobbying both their unions and their university administrations to put gender-neutral bathroom facilities on campuses. I'm not sure if that's happening here at Latrobe yet, but there are a number of other campuses like Swinburne and Monash in Victoria that are doing that at the moment. And that kind of has its own challenges as well, especially when you have campuses that can turn around and go, well, there are disabled kind of universal access toilets available, people can just use those, but then that's of course taking access away from another group of people that need those facilities for their own reasons. So a little bit of a slippery slope sometimes, but I think gradually we're seeing a real appetite for change in that area, and a lot of people getting on board. It's quite warming, yeah.
And so if we look at so obviously addressing the physical and the built environment is one way of doing it. What about and we have talked about sport. Carl, what about say policies within the university sporting clubs, for example? What do you think needs to change in order to ensure that people who identify as queer actually feel safe and included within those environments?
That's a difficult question because I'm not too familiar with their kind of constitutions of the groups at the moment, but from what I understand, whilst there are kind of written requirements for groups to be inclusive and so forth, how that's actually acted out may be very different. And so I think it's less to do with policy and more to do with practice now, and actually how the university, I hate to use the word enforces because it sounds very kind of dominant, but the way that the university kind of ensures that those written policies are actually adhered to and embraced, because whilst you may be able to say, yes, of course, a gay person or a transgender person can join this club, if there isn't the feeling that that club is actually embracing of someone from a different community, then they're not going to join.
So, and as you said, it's actually about the individual wanting to feel safe and included. So we really do need to challenge, I guess, the culture, whether it's the on-field behaviour, but also the locker room culture and spectator culture as well. When we look at sport as well, I want to just point out an incident that happened earlier this week. We all remember the AFL player Adam Goodes, who took a stand against racism. He actually physically pointed out a fan in the crowd who racially abused him. Earlier this month, a New South Wales rugby league player made a homophobic slur in an under-20 state of origin match. Now, the match review committee has advised that it will investigate the incident and with the possibility of sanctions. But this is despite the player who was abused. This player who was abused has told officials he does not want to make an official complaint. So, Ada, I might seek your view on this. It's commendable that the NRL will take action, but how important is it that athletes or players themselves actually feel comfortable to make a stand and not just shrug off this behaviour, saying, "Oh no, it's just in the gameplay. It's all right."
Well, I think first of all that any policy that deals with bias and discrimination in sport should not just focus on queer or transphobia, but should also focus on other kinds of harassment and discrimination, like, for example, racism, etc. And I think that is very important in any analysis of sporting and changing the rules and changing the culture. Yeah.
But what are some of the barriers? Why and what about some of the barriers for an athlete to not make a stand and to perhaps to sit silent and wait for the administrative wheel to kick in rather than make a stand themselves?
Well, I think part of it might come down to the fact that a lot of these sports are obviously seen as team sports, and so whilst absolutely you should expect that if someone's being discriminated or racially abused or gender abused or anything else, should be able to make a stand. The feeling that they might have about calling out one of their other teammates and saying, "You've done something wrong," especially whilst on field, if it's kind of in the changing room, maybe a different situation. I think that might be difficult for them to handle as well, because you don't want to be seen as kind of trying to be above your team or to kind of stand against your team as well.
Well, and look, I mean, I must admit, I think when we saw Adam Goodes make that stand, everyone sort of stopped and went, wow, that was a pretty powerful statement. And so I think that point about maybe feeling that maybe it takes one person to do it and then we will get a little bit of a critical mass around that. I want to just touch upon a topic that may create some controversy, but let's do it anyway. I want to talk about discrimination within the LGBTQI community itself. So we know that queerphobia exists in many different forms. I'm using the umbrella term queerphobia, many different forms within the broader community, but it's not really just about us and them. I actually recall in a number of instances in my life where I've heard gay men and lesbians describe, for example, bisexuality as a passing phase, and they question whether it is a legitimate sexual orientation. Georgia, does biphobia, transphobia and intersex-phobia exist within the LGBTQI community itself, and how might that manifest?
I'm not sure if I can answer that question, but I can certainly relate to what you said earlier about the different groups viewing each other in a discriminating way, and the example you gave about bisexuality. But I don't hear it amongst my the individuals who come to our clinic. I certainly don't hear it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
I might throw it open to the panel. Any experiences or, I guess, stories to relate around the existence of discrimination within the LGBTQI community itself?
I think it has been a much bigger issue than it is today. I would say that 15 to 20 years ago, there was a lot of rejection of the BTI, we call it the BIT, by the lesbian and gay community. But I think there is much more awareness, there's much more understanding, there's much more acceptance than there was previously. So I think things have got better. I think they've still got some way to go. And I think the comment that you made about gay and lesbian sometimes referring to bisexuals is correct, and we get it also with trans women, often described as not real women. We have some events still in Australia which are open to those that are born female rather than those who describe themselves as female, and I think that can be very, very hurtful.
Unfortunately, I would definitely agree with Brenda there. I would say that in my experience, I've seen so much of maybe one person who may be oppressed in one way. For example, they might identify as gay, therefore thinks that they have that as a get-out-of-jail-free card to oppress other people through their language, because if they're oppressed, then they can't oppress other people. And I've seen that, and my friends have told me about that through things like transphobia, through racism in events, and just those interlocking kind of forms of oppression that we really can do towards each other. And I think that's something that I, for example, really try and minimise in my life, and as much as I can. But I think it is an issue that is ongoing that we really do need to continue to focus on within our communities. So
I think it's worth, just to add to that, it's worth remembering that people from a, for want of a better term, a marginalised group would probably feel much more hurt being oppressed by a member of a similarly marginalised group than from the mass that they see as the heterosexual community or anything else. So to think of someone who is gay, say, speaking ill about someone who's trans or something like that can actually be much more hurtful, because you expect to some kind of shared experience,
solidarity and support,
exactly. That would kind of exclude you from having to deal with that from that sort of person, but it does happen.
Yeah.
Could I say something perhaps on behalf of the intersex community? One of the first things many of us say when there's a baby born is it a boy or is it a girl? And that has created the situation where we try to define a young baby as a boy or a girl at a very as early as possible. And unfortunately, several percent, perhaps up to 3 or 4% of babies might not be clearly male or female. And that has in the past driven a lot of surgical intervention, which has then often been regretted and often been inappropriate and marginalising for that individual. And it would be much better if we as a community, in terms of being more inclusive, could be inquiring about the baby's health and the mother's health rather than finding out is it a boy or is it a girl. We're all too quick sometimes, I think, to put labels and boxes on things, and often that is creating a pressure. So if there is an intersex baby, it's creating pressure on the parents, it's creating pressure on the medical advisors to clarify the situation, and that can cause a lifetime of problems.
We're almost running out of time. I would like to raise Eurovision, because it's just happened and it's caused a little bit of controversy. We all love Eurovision, let's face it. But this year, Conchita Wurst from Austria, a self-described bearded drag queen, has won Eurovision. Obviously, there was some widespread praise following her win. However, predictably, also queer-phobic criticism. Why are some people, both in the broader community but also within the queer community itself, uncomfortable with the idea of a bearded drag queen? What is it about? And
I think in this case, it wasn't necessarily about being confronted by a bearded drag queen. I think in this particular case, you had such distinct male characteristics, the beard, and such distinct female characteristics. They were both so strong that to have those together, a number of people commented to me, people who I would not have expected to be confronted by it, said that they were very confronted by Conchita, and they were trying to establish why, and that's what they came up with, and I think I agree with them. It's just that they were two so distinct features.
So do you think it's more about we feel challenged around conventions around sort of masculine and feminine
Definitely.
Beauty, for want of a better word, rather than the idea that we're just to be at a drag queen?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone else like to comment on the...
I didn't have any issues at all.
You just love the song. Great song.
Well, I thought it was a very brave person to out themselves in that way and to go on such a world stage, but did it in a very respectful way and did it in a very successful way. And I thought it added another dimension to what gender diverse is. I was delighted that the community was able to judge the music and the song and the presentation on its merit rather than be put off by what might have been a visually challenging thing.
Anyone else want to...
I would say that I haven't seen much Eurovision yet myself. However, I've got a plan of next weekend to just go for a marathon with my friend, which is going to be awesome. I'm sure we're going to be singing along by the end. I would say all of this relates to our society's continual obsession with a binary between male and female. Male must lead to masculinity, female must lead to femininity, and we just have such issues whenever that doesn't stay. And I think that really relates to the concept of what you were saying, Brenda, about babies having to be a boy or a girl and there's no space between that, and the concept of cisnormativity, where society expects people who are given a female sex at birth to grow up to be women, and those given the sex of male, which is all a construct, as we know, to grow up to be men. And I think it just really relates to that, and we're really just stuck in that mindset as a society still.
So, Beck, do people like Conchita help us in our university environments become more accepting and tolerating when we see it at such a high-profile level, and we see the Austrian Prime Minister give Conchita a hero's or heroine's welcome? Does it actually help, within the life of the university to make students become more comfortable with their own gender identity, and also other students become more accepting?
I guess my one reservation about Conchita and about her performance would be I guess for people that have not perhaps experienced something like that before, the lack of understanding between people's sex, sexuality, gender, and kind of expression of identities, and perhaps seeing here is one person's how they identify, and then extending that to all other individuals who identify as trans or gender diverse or perform in drag, which can be a completely different thing.
I guess what it does, though, is it starts a conversation. It gets people talking, which is what we've done today. I am sad to advise that we actually have run out of time. I would like to thank our panellists very much for their energy and efforts today, to Ada, to Carl, Brenda, Beck and Georgia for what has been a truly interesting and robust discussion. I would also like to thank Justin Butler from the Queer Department here at the Student Union in Latrobe University, and Devora Wynne from the counselling services here at Latrobe University for their work in behind the scenes to establish the IDAHOBIT discussion panel for 2014. Thank you all very much for your time, and let's do it again next year. Okay, thanks guys. That's all right.
It was very good.